Well, it's 4 o'clock, so we can get started. I want to thank you to this webinar featuring Dr. Carmen Imes and her work on Exodus. Dr. Imes is the Associate Professor of Old Testament at Talbot School of Theology. Her doctoral dissertation was on bearing the name. Her dissertation is published, and it's the title that has the name Yahweh in it, and then she made a more accessible version. There you go, thank you. That's the dissertation, and then made a little more accessible version of it called Bearing God's Name. Thanks. There you go. Good. And Carmen is a specialist in Exodus. And so I think we first contacted you was a couple years ago at that conference, and you agreed to do the class. So we've actually filmed the class. It's a whole class is on the book of Exodus. And she's working on her commentary, so she has every right to change her opinion between the video and the writing of the book. This will give you an insight into her personality. She is 43% done with the commentary on Exodus. It's coming out in the Baker commentary on the Old Testament series, probably in 2027. So what we're going to do is, as we normally are, is I wanted to introduce her, and then Dr. Imes is going to talk about whatever she wants to talk about in Exodus. And she'll talk about kind of the highlights that she covered in the class or things that are important to her in the book. And then many of you have submitted, and I mean many of you have submitted questions to her, and she will be answering those in the second 20-minute segment. Of course, maybe 15 and 25, whatever. And so she'll do that. And then you all can be asking questions. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom. It's down along the bottom of the screen. And just submit questions. And we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so with her answering those questions. We're hoping to have her class published in probably early spring of 2024. So it's a bit of a ways out, but anyway, Dr. Imes, thank you for being here and for sharing your heart on Exodus. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you for having me, Bill. And I'm so delighted for all of you who are joining us today, as well as for all who registered for the webinar, but are planning to watch the recording later. I understand schedules don't always allow for people to join live. So I'm delighted for those of you who are watching the recording. We had a great response. So I hope it's because you all love Exodus as much as I do. It is, I think, the best book of the Bible. It's an epic narrative of God's deliverance of his people. It's expertly crafted. There are so many beautiful aspects of the literary design of the book that I love to help people discover. It's a foundational book theologically, both for our understanding of who God is and for Israel's own self-understanding. They can't know who they are outside of this book. There is it forms a constitutional role in creating them as a nation. And I would argue it's not just about the Israelites, but I would argue that if you're a Christian, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, it is impossible for you to understand fully who you are and what your vocation is in the world without going back to Sinai and without reckoning with what happens there. So I am delighted about your interest in the book. I'm excited for the course to come out so that you can work your way through the book. I think we'll have, when it's all edited, probably 16 hours of content to take you through the book. A bit about what to expect. This is far more detail. There's far more detail in this class than what I can usually do in my typical college class. I teach mostly undergraduates here at Biola University, and we do Old Testament survey where we're just kind of flying high and going over the books. And I only have like 2 class periods to spend on Exodus, which is so sad. And that's one reason why I said yes to this opportunity, because it allowed me to slow down and help people see some of the riches that I'm seeing in the book as I work through it to write my commentary. So it's far more detail than what you'd get in a college class. but it's going to be less detail than what you'd get if you watch my weekly YouTube videos called Torah Tuesday. So on YouTube, you can search for my channel, and I have a weekly video that I put out. They're about 10 minutes long, and I'm working through the book sort of a couple of chapters behind where I am in the commentary writing. So right now I'm writing on Exodus 17, and I'm just releasing videos on Exodus 12. And so I'm working my way back through the sections I've already written and sharing some of the best insights, some of the things that I thought were the most interesting that I came across, hopefully helping people understand at a word by word level why this word, what's going on with this grammatical construction, that kind of thing. So it's less detail than that, but it's more detail than a class. We're kind of flying in the middle, again, for about 16 hours. I think there's so many great questions came in that what I'm going to do is give you two things that I think are important to help you understand the big picture of the book of Exodus. And then we'll dive into the questions because, again, some of you asked really great questions, and I'd love to talk about them. So the first thing to tell you is that Exodus is a double story. It side by side tells us the story of the rescue of Moses and then the rescue of the nation of Israel. And if you slow down and read carefully the story of the rescue of Moses, you'll pick up on all sorts of clues that point ahead to the rescue of the people of Israel. So think about it with me. You know the story of Moses. We have a Hebrew boy who's under threat of death by Pharaoh in his infancy, who then in his adulthood is under threat again of death by Pharaoh, and flees across the wilderness. Oh, I forgot part. When he's under death threat by Pharaoh as an infant, he is preserved by placing him in the reeds of the Nile River. Then he grows up, he's again under threat of death. He flees across the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, ends up at Mount Sinai, where he encounters Yahweh in the burning bush story you're familiar with, but there's this theophany at the burning bush where Yahweh reveals himself to Moses and commissions him for service. And his commissioning is for him to go back to Egypt and get the rest of the people out. So that's story number one. Story number two mimics this at every turn. So we have the Hebrew people who are under threat of death by Pharaoh. He is grinding labor out of them and mistreating them. He sends them, they finally escape after confrontation. They escape and cross the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. They end up at Mount Sinai, just as Moses had. They see Yahweh in all of his glory. And I left out the part about the reeds. As they leave Egypt, they cross through the Sea of Reeds. The Bible never calls it in Hebrew the Red Sea. In Hebrew, it's the Sea of Reeds. So we have the reeds of the Nile that Moses was hidden in, and then we have the Sea of Reeds that the people cross through. They cross the wilderness. They end up at Sinai. They meet Yahweh in all his glory and experience him speaking to them. And then he commissions them for his service to represent him among the nations. So we have a mini story with Moses that then expands into a larger story highlighting God's action with the rest of the nation. I would call the book of Exodus a creation narrative. We usually think of creation in conjunction with Genesis, but Exodus tells us the story of the creation of the nation of Israel. And there are all sorts of echoes of the Genesis creation story in this second one. I'll just show you one example from Exodus chapter 1. As the story begins in Egypt, part of setting the scene for this book, the narrator tells us, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them." If you're familiar with Genesis 1, you've heard all sorts of echoes here. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. the mandate that God gives humanity at creation to be fruitful and multiply is being fulfilled in the nation of Israel. But instead of subduing creation, they are being subdued by this dynastic ruler who is exploiting their labor rather than co-laboring with them. So all sorts of Genesis echoes right from the get-go. And as you follow them through the book, you find that throughout the book, we get Genesis echoes. So there's echoes of Genesis in the plagues that come against Egypt, in the crossing of the sea, where God, with his breath or with a wind, same word as Genesis 1 verse 2, the spirit hovering over the waters, the wind or spirit splits the sea and the people pass through on dry ground. And it's the same word for dry ground that we have in Genesis when God creates on day 5 dry ground for nope, that's day 3. Day 3, the creation of dry ground for animals and for humans to eventually populate. So lots of things when they get to the Mount Sinai and God gives the instructions for building the tabernacle is filled with creation echoes. There's a tree, there's lights, there's gemstones, just like we had in the garden in Genesis 2. So I think Exodus is a creation story. That's part of what I will teach in this course. So it's a double story. It's also, the second thing I want to share with you is that the book of Exodus is also a story about worship. People often think of the book of Exodus as a story about liberation or freedom. And while it's true that God sets his people free from Egypt, they are not free in an ultimate or existential sense. The book clearly frames the freedom of the Israelites as freedom for service. So they begin, in the beginning of the book, they serve Pharaoh. He is the recipient of their labor. And at the end of the book, what they're moving into is service of Yahweh. So they're not freed just to go do whatever they want and choose their own adventure. The clear request, the clear demand, I should say, that Yahweh is making of Pharaoh is set my people free that they may serve me. So you're exploiting them, you're requiring their labor, but I created every human being in my image, as my image, in order that they might work together, collaborate together, and accomplish my will in the earth, not your will, Pharaoh. And so God is setting his people free so that they can serve him. And so the culmination of the book is, again, not liberation, but the culmination of the book is worship at Mount Sinai as they encounter Yahweh, as they bring him offerings, as they build the tabernacle and prepare to leave Sinai with his presence in their midst. It's a book about worship. So those are some of the foundational pieces that I wanted to start with. And I could talk a lot more about the book, but I think I want to turn to your questions because so many good questions came in and they will get us back in the book. I'm somebody who, even when people aren't asking me about Exodus is what I talk about because I'm spending hours a day studying this amazing, remarkable book. And it doesn't matter what I'm teaching on, there's always an illustration I could pull in from Exodus. So we had a question from Mark. Was the burning bush in Exodus 3 verse 2 a thorn bush? My answer to that question is I don't know. I don't know what kind of, the text does not say what kind of bush it is, but I will throw out there that the word describing the bush is a bit unusual. It's a rare word. The word in Hebrew is sneh. It's a sneh bush or a sneh bush. And you can maybe hear in the name of the bush where we got the name of the mountain. It's very likely that the mountain is called Sinai because of the experience of encountering God at the bush. So it's the Sinai bush. Sinai is the name of the mountain. So it's the same consonants with different vowels. And we don't know about what kind of bush it is. There have been speculations. One of the difficult things about biblical scholarship is identifying species of species of animals and of even kinds of food and colors and flavors. These are the kinds of things that are really hard because we don't have a glossary given to us from ancient times. But we do have this kind of wordplay connection between the name of the bush and the name of the mountain. All right. Bill, I'm happy for you to help decide which of these questions to answer next, or I can just keep on trucking through them.
I would just keep trucking through.
Okay, will do. All right, so Isaac asked, how important was Aaron to Moses? Moses is a man who was appointed by God to lead, but he was not able to do the task by himself. You are probably familiar with the scene in chapter 3 where Moses is being commissioned by God to go back to Egypt. And it's if you're Moses, this is a frightening prospect because when you left Egypt, people were trying to murder you. In fact, the king himself was trying to murder you. So it's very likely that Moses feels a sense of relief when he first hears from God in chapter 3 that God has heard the cries of his people in Egypt and that he has come down to rescue them. That would have been great news to Moses because he seemed to have an impulse for wanting to do something about this in chapter 2 when he tries to prevent the Egyptian from mistreating the Hebrews. But he was ineffective at solving that problem. So to hear that God is wanting to take care of this is wonderful news until God says, so go, I'm sending you to Egypt to do this. And Moses' initial response in chapter 3, verse 11 is, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? That he's looking at himself and he sees like, I'm not, you got the wrong guy here. I've already tried this and it hasn't worked. Plus I'm a wanted man. The Hebrews will never accept me. I'm not one of them. And I'm no longer one of the Egyptians because I betrayed them. So it would be a mess for me to go back. But God's response to Moses is so beautiful. He says, when Moses says, who am I? God doesn't respond with, here are all your qualifications. And Moses has many that God could have mentioned. But God says, I will be with you. And that is the most important thing. It doesn't matter who Moses is. It matters that God is with him. But Moses is still struggling. He presents God with several objections. And later in chapter 4, he brings up the objection of his speech. Moses says in chapter 4, verse 10, pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. This might sound a little bit like Moses just has a bit of stage fright, or he's not very eloquent. The Hebrew is more jumbled than what our English translations make it sound like. It's a very stumbly kind of a sentence. I've never been good at this thing neither yesterday nor the day before that. And my tongue is heavy. And God's response to him is to say, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Which is what he means, but in Hebrew it says, I will be with your mouth. And so that's been translated in the NIV as, I will help you speak. But I love the symmetry of the Hebrew between chapter 3, verse 12, where God says, I will be with you. And then Moses complains, oh, but I have this speech impediment. And it does seem to be an actual diagnosable speech impediment, not just a fear of speaking, because the phrase that he uses, being heavy of tongue, is also a phrase that appears in Akkadian lists in medical texts of disabilities. So I'm of the persuasion that Moses is disabled, and yet God responds, I will be with your mouth. But the way that God will be with his mouth is by sending Aaron as his sidekick or as his assistant. And I think this is so interesting because God could have healed Moses of this speech impediment. He could have said, I made your mouth and now I'm going to heal you. But he implies that he did not make a mistake when he made Moses with a speech impediment, but that it was part of his design, part of his good design. If we've assumed that the ideal human state is to be fully independent and not to need anyone, then we are wrong. God designs us for interdependence. He designs us to need each other. And so God designed Moses with a need that Aaron was able to fill. Aaron was able to be Moses' spokesman. And together they go back to Egypt, and together they accomplish the work that God called Moses to do. And there's so many lessons in this that are applicable to our own lives of faith. If you feel like you have limitations, just know that God doesn't make mistakes, that those limitations are to enable you to lean into interdependence and collaboration with others, and that's what God designed us to do. So the question was, how important was Aaron to Moses? And the answer is, Moses could not have done this job without Aaron. I think I can sort of hear in the background the words of Genesis chapter 2. It is not good for man to be alone. We're not supposed to carry out God's call on our lives single-handedly. He designs us for community, and he invites us into that. All right, another question. I'm just reading it here. I'm going to do a question from Brian. How is the Exodus used in the rest of Scripture? In other words, how does the Exodus prepare us for receiving the gospel in Jesus Christ at both his first and second advents? We could spend all day answering that question because the Exodus is massive in the rest of the Bible. There are so many echoes of this event. In fact, every time Israel is told to remember their history, the Exodus is part of the story that they tell to remember. They could scarcely be who they are without this event. And one of the sections of this course that I've recorded here for biblical training will look at some of those echoes in the rest of Scripture. But it's only possible to even just hint at them because there's so many, or to scratch the surface. And so if we fast forward to Christ, we see all kinds of parallels between Christ leading us out of bondage to sin and death and into freedom to serving God with the Exodus. Christ is presented by the New Testament as the Passover lamb. Of course, Passover is the celebration, the ritual that the families celebrate together on the night before they leave Egypt. And God institutes that ritual as a way of marking themselves as God's people, God's covenant people. They physically mark their doorways with the blood of the lamb, and the angel of death passes by their houses while Yahweh covers over the doorposts and covers over the doorway and protects them from death. And that protection that's available through the blood of the Passover lamb is similar. It's analogous to the protection that we enjoy because of Christ, the Passover lamb. So the New Testament writers draw on this. There's all kinds of imagery throughout Scripture about God's presence in sacred space, the tabernacle, and later the temple. And then, of course, the book of Hebrews reflecting on the spiritual significance of the temple and how Jesus is both the high priest and the sacrifice, how he makes a way for us to come into the very presence of God. So the rest of the Bible is very difficult to understand without a grasp on Exodus because it features so strongly throughout the rest of the Bible. There's a book that I'll recommend. I don't have it right here next to me, but it's called Exodus in the New Testament. And it has wonderful chapters by different New Testament scholars, each one on echoes of Exodus in another book of the New Testament. And then I've written the final chapter in that volume, a review essay, kind of reflecting from the point of view of an Exodus scholar on all of these New Testament reflections. It's a very worthwhile volume, Exodus in the New Testament. It's edited by Seth E. Horn. Okay, great question from Luke. He asks, when discussing narrative patterns in Scripture, and I do that a lot in this course, There appears to be a gradient of beliefs. Some feel that God arranged historical events precisely into that order, while others believe such patterns to be the work of writers and arrangers of the text who were either inspired by God or had their own personal reasons to do so. Based on your study of the narrative patterns in Exodus, how do you thread the needle in this area of Scripture? I love this question. Some have asked, what's going to make your commentary on Exodus different than all the other commentaries that are already out there? And there are, more than a dozen Exodus commentaries out there. One thing that I am spending quite a bit of time on, more than what I've seen other commentaries do, is on the literary design of the book, the genius of the way the stories are arranged and the way they're told. And sometimes that makes people nervous, because they think if you're talking about the literary design, then you must not think it's historical. So this is a great time to let you all know that I think the book of Exodus actually happened. I think the events in the book of Exodus actually happened. I think there really was a Moses. The Hebrews really were enslaved in Egypt. Moses and his brother Aaron really did lead them out. They crossed the wilderness and met Yahweh at Sinai and built the tabernacle. I'm conservative in that regard. However, I have seen lots of evidence for the genius behind the way the stories are being told. So the choice of vocabulary that brings out particular connections, like the sea of reeds and the reeds of the Nile. The narrator didn't have to mention the reeds in chapter 2, but by mentioning the reeds, we get this connection or echo between the rescue of Moses and the rescue of the nation of Israel. Some of the strangest stories in this book, I have seen the most light shed on those strange stories when considering where are they in the narrative and how does its literary context help me understand the reason why it needed to be here. I'll talk a little bit later. There a couple of questions came in about the Zipporah episode in chapter 4. I'll talk about that in a little bit as one example, but another example is what happens in the wilderness. So I'm working on the wilderness narratives right now. And in the wilderness, we have multiple incidents. So we have people complaining about lack of water, and God heals the water at Marah that's bitter. Then we have the provision of manna and quail in response to the people's complaining. Then the fighting against the Amalekites, the battle with the Amalekites in chapter 17, following another request for water. And as you start to look at these stories, if you've ever done a Bible read through where you're trying to read through the whole Bible in a certain amount of time, you read through Exodus, you get through Leviticus, and you get into Numbers, and it's like, wait, I've already read stories just like this before. In Numbers, we have a battle with the Amalekites, provision of quail and manna, provision of water, people complaining and being and experiencing judgment for it. There are all sorts of things that happen on either side of Israel's time at Sinai, and one way to explain the presence in both places. So some scholars will come to this and say, oh, this only happened once, but there were two literary traditions, like two people wrote it down, different accounts of the memory of these events. And one ended up in Exodus and one ended up in Numbers, but it's the same event. My approach is to say, actually, God provided manna every day, the whole 40 years that they're in the wilderness. It's only mentioned once in Exodus and once in Numbers, and the placement of those episodes have a kind of framing effect that draws our attention to the middle of the scene. So very conveniently, I have over my shoulder here a framed picture of Mount Sinai. And you can see that it's framed with a dark wooden frame. But when you frame a picture to put it on your wall, the point is not for people to look at the frame. The frame draws your attention to the center. And in a similar way, I think the wilderness stories on either side of Sinai have a kind of framing effect that draws our attention to the mountain in the middle and to all that God does there, which is really, it's not that we don't learn anything from the wilderness. We do. We discover a lot about who God is. But it's at Sinai that we discover the fullness of God's character, the requirements that he has for his covenant partners, for Israel, the parameters of how they're going to relate to him. What happens at Sinai is of such crucial importance that I think whoever finalized the whole Torah took great pains to frame it carefully on either side. And we have some evidence that the episodes in Exodus in the wilderness have been rearranged so that we're not seeing them in precisely the chronological order as it would be if we had just a blow-by-blow account. So I'll give you one example. In chapter 17, we're still in the wilderness. According to chapter 19, 19 verse 1 says, on the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. It's a very extended tag telling us the timing of the arrival and the location of the arrival at Mount Sinai. It's a momentous event to arrive at Sinai. But if you go back to 17, we're told that when the people don't have water, they're quarreling because they need water to drink while they camped at Rephidim, which is the campsite just before they get to Sinai. And God's solution to this is in verse 5, take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this. Well, Horeb, according to chapter 3, is the mountain where Moses encounters Yahweh at the burning bush. And Yahweh says to him, you will know that I am who I say I am when you arrive back at this mountain with the people of Israel. So there's a clear connection between the mountain that Moses gets commissioned on and the mountain where the Israelites meet Yahweh. It's the same mountain. It's called Horeb in chapter 3. It mentions Horeb here in 17 and doesn't call it Sinai until 19, as if I feel like it's downplaying this is Mount Sinai because we're not to the momentous arrival yet, even though they're so close that they could just walk over and get water from Sinai. They're not yet quite camped in the shadow of the mountain, but they're nearby. And this suggests to me that perhaps chapter 17 happened during the whole year that they were at Sinai, but that the story is being moved before their arrival as a part of the framing because it belongs with wilderness wanderings, not with what happened at Sinai. So that helps it to have a sort of framing, the frame on the other side with the book of Numbers. So I don't know if that's coming through very clearly, but that's one example. In the course, when I talk about the literary framing of Sinai, I give the whole chiasm or literary sandwich that is on either side, and it's like 12 layers deep of things in a row that happen before and after Sinai. And it seems to me that some rearrangement would have been necessary to achieve that kind of literary symmetry. But I don't see that as a violating historicity, because the point of Exodus is not necessarily to say, here's blow by blow what happened, but look at who God is and look at the relationship he's called us into with him. So I think there's room for some what's the word I want? I was going to say literary artistry. The author has literary license to rearrange some episodes. We see this in the Gospels very clearly. We have 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then we have John that puts things in different orders. So did the cleansing of the temple happen at the beginning of Jesus' ministry or at the end, or did it happen twice? And I would be among those who would say it happened once. But John is locating it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry for theological and thematic reasons. He wants us to understand all of Jesus' ministry through the lenses of what he does on the day when he cleanses the temple. And I think it's similar here in Exodus with arrangement of material. So thank you, Luke, for that really great question. All right. Jonathan asks, Dr. Imes, how much correlation do you find in the angel of Yahweh with Jesus? I might be in the minority on this. There is a lot of emphasis in some circles to finding either types of Christ in the Old Testament or Christophanies, that is, appearances of Christ in the Old Testament. I do not think that the angel of Yahweh is Jesus. And I do not think that we have any Christophanies in the Old Testament. And the reason for that is because I believe that the event of Christ taking on human flesh in the Gospels is so theologically momentous. The Bible presents it as something that is completely new and fresh, and the inbreaking of God into human history in a way that I think is diminished if Christ has already come in the flesh before that time. I might be wrong about this, but I've read some articles that convinced me of that. I think the angel of Yahweh is just what it says it is. It's a very prominent angel as part of God's angelic host, who is God's emissary and speaks on God's behalf. There's sometimes confusion on the identity of the angel, because the angel will arrive and say, I say to you. And I understand the eyes when the angel speaks as the angel's authorized to deliver God's messages. So that doesn't make the angel God, but it means he's the one reading the proclamation or declaring the proclamation as if God were speaking. So that's how I understand it. I recognize that I'm probably in the minority position on that.
Dr. Imes, it's probably time to start answering some of the questions. Like, we got a ton of them have been coming in.
Sure.
So if that's okay.
Yeah.
Although I would say, if you want to know what the burning bush really is, it's still growing at St. Catherine's Monastery. They will show it to you there and make sure that you understand that really is the burning bush.
And what is it? A thorn bush, Bill? The one that's growing at St. Catherine's?
It's 20 feet up in the air, spreads out over a whole part of the building. I wasn't close enough to see.
Yeah.
But anyway, all right. I got to ask you this question. Tamar Franklin says, "What's that tattoo on your right wrist? It looks like Hebrew." I had to ask that question.
It does look like Hebrew because it is Hebrew. So
It is Hebrew.
This says belonging to Yahweh. So if you can read Hebrew, or you recognize, if you take off this first letter, it reads from left to right. The first letter is Lamed, which is letter L in Hebrew. And what we have left is the divine name, YHWH, Yahweh. And so if you put the Lamed on the front of a name, it means belonging to. And so this is what it says in Isaiah 44, verse 5. That people will write on their hands the Lord's, or belonging to Yahweh.
All right. I'm sure it's a slip. It is right to left, not left to right.
That was a slip. Yes, right to left. I'm like doing this backwards in the camera.
I figured that's what it was with the mirroring stuff going on.
Thank you. And Bill, I know you wanted to talk about the second commandment, so maybe now would be a good time to do it. The reason that I got the tattoo is because I wrote my dissertation on the command from the 10 Commandments, the command not to take the Lord's name in vain, which in Hebrew reads, you shall not bear the name of Yahweh in vain, or carry it. And so I was studying, what would it mean if we took this at face value, that people are carrying or bearing the name of Yahweh. And we have in close proximity in Exodus 28, the instructions for the high priestly garments, We have the same language describing the names of the 12 tribes that Aaron is carrying on his chest, each one engraved on a gemstone. And then on his forehead, he has a medallion, a gold medallion that says "Holy belonging to Yahweh," the same belonging to Yahweh that I have on my wrist here. And so the argument of my dissertation, which Bill mentioned earlier, bearing Yahweh's name at Sinai, is that when Israel arrived at Sinai, God was stamping them with his name, an invisible stamp with his name, claiming them as his own and saying, "You are my people, you belong to me. Now you officially represent me among the nations." So the command is not policing their speech or just saying telling them not to say the name of Yahweh in a certain way, but it's much bigger than that. It's saying, "You are my representatives, so go out and live like it. Don't carry my name in vain." So then I've taken that same idea and made it more accessible in Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. I'm tracing that theme of bearing God's name through the whole Bible. So then I decided to just make it permanent. And I found out last week that Beth Moore has the same tattoo, only hers in the same spot, only hers is in English. It says "the Lord's."
Oh,
Just for fun.
I did not know that. It's I think the bearing the name is a message that the church needs to hear today so loudly, because there are people who claim to be Christians. In fact, my wife saw a stat the other day that the average number of times that people who go to church read their Bible is like once every 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so not that the Bible reading is the be all and end all, but the point is, if we claim to be a follower of Christ, if we claim to be a Christian, and then we go out and we swear, or we live life like Christ doesn't matter, then we are bearing his name, "I'm a Christian," in vain. And that's a violation. And it just seems it's everywhere I look.
Yeah. It is everywhere. Yep.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was timing of the Exodus. Where did you come down on that? Or have you come down on that yet?
I have not yet written the introduction to the commentary, and so that allows me to remain an agnostic for now. There are, of course, two primary dates that people choose: the early date or the late date. I talk about it a little bit in the course, and I tend to lean towards the later date. That seems to fit more things in my mind, but I still haven't done a full investigation of the timing yet. I've been focused more on the literary design and the just translating it and understanding it first.
Yeah. We got a question about the poster of Exodus. They want to know if that's the one from the Bible Project.
It is.
I want to know. It is, okay.
Yeah.
Where's Sinai? I know there's a traditional site. I've climbed it. Well, I didn't climb it. I rode a camel.
Rode a camel? Cheater.
I should have walked it. But anyway, or there's another one. Where do you think Sinai is?
Yeah, so this is another part that will something I'll have to investigate a little more fully when I write the introduction to the commentary, which I'm saving till last. I tend to think the traditional site is like, I haven't been persuaded that the traditional site is wrong. That there are some who argue that it's in Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, and that site was not open for outsiders to come and study, for archaeologists to get in there and study it until just a few years ago. So I think the jury is still out on whether that could be it. It seems too far away for me from Egypt to be plausible, but I'm curious. For me, the actual location is much less important, not because I don't think it happened. I think it did happen, but finding the location doesn't solve any, I don't know that it offers us much payoff in the way that we understand the book.
Yeah. Your comment about disabilities was fascinating to me. That we were built for interdependence. And if you know of anyone with significant disabilities, I'm thinking of a good friend who's a pastor. His daughter is seriously disabled. She just went away to college. It's so cool that she's not letting it get in the way of living. but she's interdependent. And so, how strong of a theme in Exodus do you think that is? Is it just kind of hidden between the lines, or
Mm.
um,
I think there's a it we see it not just with Moses' need for Aaron, but also in the fact that the people come out together, kind of a mixed crowd, and as they gather around Mount Sinai in the presence of God, they become an organized community. And
mhm,
again, this isn't about self-actualization. We don't have individual Hebrews who are just going off and doing their own thing after they leave Egypt. God is God's saving his people and rescuing them and making them into something together. And I
mhm,
really think that that's something we need to recover in the West, because our European American heritage really emphasizes individual autonomy as if that's the goal. And anyone who can't live independently from their parents, oh, they've never reached adulthood. And I think, that's not how the Bible presents human community. So I'm actually working on. So we didn't mention this earlier, but I had a new book come out in June that's a companion volume to Bearing God's Name, called Being
mm,
God's Image: Why Creation Still Matters. And I'm working on a third volume called Becoming God's Family: Why the Church Still Matters, where I plan to lean into this idea of interdependence a little more, because I think there are a lot of people today who are saying, yeah, I'm all for Jesus, but I just don't need the church. And I don't think that the Bible presents us the possibility of following Jesus all by ourselves. I think we're called into a family.
I remember hearing once that if God had just saved us, that'd been great, but he did more. He adopted us into a
Mm,
family. Do you
yes.
think that what you're talking about in Exodus is kind of preparing people for what Christian community is supposed to be?
Exactly. Yes. Because God says in chapter 4, Israel is my firstborn son. There's familial language being
Right.
used, and again, communal language in so many beautiful ways. Even the Passover event itself, the
Mhm.
Passover ritual, they're told um, to, to, to not divide, not eat just part of a lamb. When they choose their Passover lamb, they need to let none of it go to waste. So they're supposed to like bring into their household their neighbors until they have just the right number of mouths to feed with that size lamb. It's not something like, we're going to get the best lamb in the neighborhood and have, throw away the leftovers. It's something that brings people together so that nothing's wasted. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, yeah, that's a strong picture of community.
Mm-hmm.
Question, anonymous question came in about Reed Sea and Red Sea.
Okay.
And is the Reed Sea, whatever it was, still around? Is it Suez Canal? Well, there are several questions along those lines. So,
Yes.
Red
Okay.
Sea,
So
Reed Sea.
yes. So James Hoffmeyer is the expert on these issues, and he's an evangelical Egyptologist, and he's studied this question for many, many years. I'm going, Lord willing, going to Egypt with him in January.
Ooh.
Obviously, the region is not
Yeah.
super stable right now, but they're telling me it still would work to go. So I'll see what he says. His books are in the process of being revised for new editions are coming out next year. And so I'm hesitant to like be firm on the actual location. The bodies of water have changed between then and now. And um, and so I would say probably the building of the Suez Canal has drained and changed, like it's drained the sea that the Israelites would have crossed. And so we're not going to be able to see a body of water where they crossed. But there's plenty of other factors that can be coordinated together to figure out an approximate location. And I think Hoffmeyer says it's somewhere in the Bitter Lakes region that they
Mm.
probably crossed. But interestingly, the Bible always calls it the Sea of Reeds. And if anyone's wondering why do we call it the Red Sea, it's a long-standing tradition that probably dates back to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And apparently in Greek thought, they associated the cardinal directions, the points on the compass, with colors, and red
Mm.
was south and black was north. So you have the
Oh,
Black Sea and the Red Sea. And so that's probably where we get the name Red Sea. But I like to, in my commentary, I talk about the Sea of Reeds because I want to preserve that symmetry with Exodus 2.
I'm sitting trying to remember where I heard this. I think it was a Josh McDowell talk with Campus Crusade for Christ, and he was dealing with the issue that the Reed Sea was only 6 inches deep, and there was no parting of the water. He had a great comeback. He said, "That's even a greater miracle. That means he drowned the entire Egyptian army in 6 inches of water."
Yes, I remember that too. I remember
Okay.
hearing that as a kid. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a related question here in the that came in earlier that maybe would be a good time to deal with, and that's the archaeological findings. This viewer says, I struggle with the fact that there have been no archaeological findings to support the 40-year wilderness experience, and it causes me to battle doubts. I think that's an important one to answer. So there are two issues that I think, or two approaches that I think can help with this. Number one, what would we expect to find? So thinking about this is before plastics, before disposable everything. If you've got people who are traveling on foot across the desert with all their children and their flocks and herds, they are taking only what is absolutely necessary, and they're not going to waste any of it. They're not eating a diet that's high in, like, they're not eating a ton of meat, so we're not going to find a lot of bones. They're subsisting on manna. If a clay pot breaks, then there might be a few pottery shards, but I would think they'd be pretty careful with their clay pots because it's going to be hard to make new ones in the desert. So I wouldn't actually expect, if one of you said to me, we went camping last summer in Yosemite, let's say you even did a long camping trip at Yosemite, let's say you stayed there for months, would I right now be able to go back and find evidence that you camped there? Let's hope not. Let's hope you packed your trash out, and let's hope you didn't leave anything behind. I think sometimes we have too high of expectations for what we would find in that situation. These are nomadic people. They don't tend to leave much evidence of where they've been. We have a lot of evidence from later in Israel's history, like in the time of the kings. We've got all kinds of stuff, seals and monuments and walls and tunnels, and it's fun. It's really fun. I sometimes tell my students, if any of you invent a way of doing time travel, could you do all of us a really big favor? And could you go back to the time of Abraham and Moses, and could you just tell them to leave more signs places, like just put up more monuments and inscribe them? Wouldn't it be great if we found a tent peg that said belonging to Moses? Unfortunately, I don't think they inscribed their tent pegs. And if they left one behind, then some nomadic tribe moving through the area later would certainly have taken it and put it to good use. So I wouldn't expect to find very much evidence of Israelites in the wilderness. The other line of evidence that I think is helpful is to reconsider the number of Israelites that left Egypt. I actually just released a YouTube video last week on this, so I won't go into all the details, but you can check it out on my Torah Tuesday channel, and I do talk about it in the course as well. But there is a Hebrew translation issue where it says in Exodus 12 that 600,000 men left Egypt. I think that's a mistranslation. I think it's 600 military units of Israelite men left Egypt, plus their families. And that takes it, and this answers another question that someone asked, that takes it from 2.5 to 3 million people leaving all at once, which, by the way, exceeds the number that archaeologists say lived in Egypt at that time. They're estimating New Kingdom Egypt had 2.12 million 2.12 million Egyptians or residents. So if we have more than that who Hebrews leaving, it doesn't really work. That brings the number down to more like 22,000, maybe 30,000 Israelites leaving Egypt, which is it's helpful in lots of ways. It's helpful for the size of the army fighting the Amalekites, the amount of manna and water that are needed, and the reason why we don't find any hard evidence of their having traveled across the wilderness. So again, check out that video if you want more detail.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues in my book on why I trust the Bible. I
Mm,
wanted to get into, but I could not remember the Hebrew word, so I left it out. So I'll go check Torah Tuesday, and I'll do
yes.
an appendix to the book. Hey, I think we have time for one more question, but I'm
Okay.
going to ask you a doozy.
Okay.
Okay, so you have 3 minutes for a doozy question. Roberto wants to ask. God is all knowing, but when Moses prayed to God not to annihilate the Hebrew people, does it mean that Moses
Hmm.
changed the plan of God?
Hmm. This
In other
is
words,
such a good question.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So we're talking about Exodus 32. The Israelites have built the golden calf, they're worshiping it. Yahweh announces to Moses that he's going to wipe out the people and start over with Moses and make him the head of a new nation. And you would think, if you're Moses, this would be like, wow, upward mobility. Now's
Yeah.
my chance to like get rid of all these people who've been complaining to me in the wilderness and not trusting my leadership. But Moses intercedes, and this is one piece of evidence we have of the transformation that Moses experiences in this book. He goes from navel gazing in chapter 3, who am I that I should lead Israel out of Egypt, to in chapter 33 and 34 saying, I am not willing to leave this mountain unless your presence goes with us. It's such a transformation in his priorities and what he values. And right here at this place where we're seeing this evidence of change, we have Moses' intercession. And I love it because he's recognizing that the people of Israel bear God's name, that because God has placed his name on these people, now what they do and what happens to them will be a reflection on God's own character. And so he says in chapter 32, verse 11, Yahweh, why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. So Moses is appealing to God's reputation among the nations and to the covenant that he made with Abraham. And that is so beautiful because it shows us that Moses' priorities have become God's priorities. And then it says Yahweh repented or relented. The NIV says relented, but it's the same word that's elsewhere translated repented, and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. And so there are two schools of thought on this. Either Yahweh never planned to actually wipe out the people. He was just testing Moses. And now he sees, okay, Moses shares my heart. And so now I can let him know what my real plan is, which is not to wipe them out. Or we could conclude that Yahweh was within his rights. It was consistent with his character to wipe out the people based on the extent of their rebellion. But that Moses appealed to God's mercy, which is also within God's character. And so God was actually persuaded not to wipe them out. And so those are the two views. I lean towards this being a genuine change of heart on God's part, and that there's actually that the world is not all pre-scripted and predetermined, that we're just kind of like machines going through what God has already decreed will happen, but that there's actually a dynamic quality to our relationship with God in which we have a kind of partnership where God can be affected, God's plans can be affected by our participation, and our prayers actually have an effect. That's mind-blowing to me. It's daunting. It makes me think, man, I need to pray more seriously because God's invited me into this kind of a partnership with him, and that's beautiful. There's maybe a third way of looking at this, and that is that Moses has special access to an intercessory role in relation to God that the average person doesn't. So I suppose you could sort of say this is a little bit different situation. We don't mimic it. But yeah, these are the things people like to debate about.
Yeah. I remember when I was pastoring, my line always was that prayer moves God to do things he might not otherwise do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how else to read the text without
Mm-hmm.
thinking that prayers have efficacy, and
Yeah.
God is has committed himself to do that.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much. We appreciate
Mm-hmm.
the time. I'm really glad you brought up Torah Tuesday. I'd encourage all of you to subscribe to her channel and help her think through things in Exodus. You
Yes.
actually can
Yeah.
be a part of the process, and I think that's really good. This has been recorded. There'll be a link posted in the Q&A section and on the website after all, that if you know people that wanted to watch and weren't able to, they're going to be able to do that. We're
Mm-hmm.
also going to try to answer all the questions that you asked, but we weren't able to get to. And as we're able to do that, that'll get posted there as well. I also wanted to mention in closing that we were able to raise the funds to cover the recording costs, but we still have production costs, which are roughly $10,000 to $12,000.
Mm.
So if you'd like to participate in helping making Dr. Imes's class available to the world, there's also going to be a link in the Q&A section and on the website about how you can donate. But Dr. Imes, thank you so much for your time and for your work. And we look forward to the class and to the commentary. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was great to meet with all of you, and sorry we didn't get to all the questions.
Yeah, thank you.